Hey there, BookTube. Welcome back to another thrilling episode of Buck's Books. It is I, your favorite middlingly literate internet barbarian, Buck. Unfortunately, we will not be joined by my co-host and attorney, Beef and Duke, for a while because he went too hard in the paint at the dog park and tore his doggy ACL. And then I had to take him to the vet to get all chopped up, and they rebuilt his leg, and now he is utterly zooted on doggy gabapentin. So he will not be present in any videos because he's not standing up so good at this juncture. He's such a good boy. He's got a big ridiculous cone on, and they shaved like a quarter of his body for some reason, and he's got a nasty Frankenstein scar up his leg, and he's really going through it right now. So, thoughts and prayers. He's over there. He's zonked unconscious on the carpet. I just put a blanket over him. He'll be all right. So it's just us today. It's just me and you. And today we are going to be talking about The Decadent Society by Ross Douthat, who is apparently a New York Times columnist, which in my opinion does not work in his favor. The main thrust of the Decadent Society is the idea that we are this decadent society like Rome was, right? So eventually when a society when a society stops struggling and suffering, when a society achieves a level of greatness that it can then convert into comfort, the society will fall back on comfort and rest on its laurels from that point forward. And at that point, you're embracing stagnation. And that stagnation will carry forward into the future, and like all stagnations, will cause things to rot. The sickly sweet decay, And our man Douthat, Douthat, Ross thinks that that's what's happening right now. Ross compared it to Rome many times, and that's because Rome fell. Excuse me. Rome fell, and Rome fell only because it got too big and too decadent. It got too perfect. Things went too well in Rome. They managed to destroy all of the outside invaders, or at least bring them to heel. They constructed the most elaborate city that existed at the time. They had technology that was unparalleled anywhere else. The aqueducts, they were capable of staving off excuse me. They were capable of staving off the plagues, which was just unheard of in these early megalopolises. I don't know how to pluralize the Greek word. And it doesn't matter at all. They just did so good in Rome that nothing could kill Rome except Rome. And that's what wound up happening. They were too stable, and they went to fat. They didn't have to worry. They didn't have to strive. The expansion ceased. And when it did, what remained could not maintain its internal stability and eventually crumbled. And so the moral fortitude that Rome had been built on, these same morals that they had borrowed from the Greeks, that also sort of went to rot. So they became a culture of comfort rather than striving and achievement. They were hoarding. They were embracing this total hedonism. Remember Hedonism Bot from Futurama? He was just like the robot Caesar, always eating grapes. Well, I mean, that's why. Because that Rome was associated with the myth of the vomitorium. All of it. Rome was like that, and the argument that Douthat is trying to make is that we are like that now. And what he kept coming back to is the relatively interesting point that a movie like Back to the Future wouldn't work now in the way that it did then. Because as of the writing of this book, in 2020, so yeah, we're close enough, comparing the 1980s when Marty McFly was a kid and he traveled back to the past, which was around 1950-ish, yeah? Something like that. If we have any Back to the Future historians in the audience, feel free to correct me, but I'm not going to look it up. So I know that Marty McFly was in the 80s because of his cool vest and the skateboarding. And he went back to 1950 in the past, right? And then he had to get to the future once again. But it was like a whole different world. It was like an alien world for him, the world of the 50s. You know, there were so many huge differences between the experience that he lived in the 80s and the experience that he had teleported into in the Flying DeLorean in the 50s. So, comparably, that would be like us right now in 2025. 2024 is when this is, but 2020 is when this book was written. Us in, let's say 2020, just for the sake of consistency, traveled back 30 years to 1990. 1990 is not that different. Like, it was mind-blowing for Marty McFly because of what they didn't have, and just what an alien experience, and how completely divorced from his understanding of reality everybody else was. It was entering a different world. It wouldn't be entering a different world for us, for me, to return to 1990. I remember I remember the 1990s. I don't remember 1990, I was 3. But I remember the 1990s, and, like, we already had technology. We already had a Game Boy. We didn't have cell phones. We didn't have the technological capacity. But everything else was the same. Cars were functionally the same. There was no major upheaval. There was no significant life-changing political thing. Like the 50s were looking at they just got out of World War II, and they were looking at the Cold War, you know? And in the 80s, they were still experiencing the Cold War, but he was 30 years. He couldn't conceive of something as just dramatic, and not even life-changing, because that's too small a scale. This changed all of these lives, did World War II. Like, it changed the entire cultural zeitgeist of the world. So there's nothing comparable for us to have that. We've had wars, I guess you could say, like 9/11, but 9/11 was a day, whereas World War II was years, and resulted in the baby boom thereafter. So Douthat Ross, I'm gonna go with Ross from now on. Our boy Ross talks about that, and he talks about, for as lauded as Rome was, and as much as they had accomplished early when they'd first established the empire, they stopped accomplishing. And when you stop accomplishing, everything starts to fall apart. It can only go in one direction, and that's either up or down. Either things are getting better or things are getting worse. And if things haven't gotten better in a while, I got news for you. It's like, what kept coming back to me was that Warren Zevon song. You ever hear it when he says, "I've been to Rome, and it ain't that pretty at all"? That's about the size of it. I too have been to Rome, and the truth is, it ain't that pretty at all. And it can be argued that I am currently living in a declining Rome. And I gotta tell you, fellas, it ain't that pretty at all. He spends a lot of time talking about just sort of what the technological advances that we live with and have become accustomed to have done to us. And it's very Ted Pilled, it's very Join Me in the Shrub. There is this element of a loss of, I guess we'd call it high culture. We don't have high culture. He made some convincing points about how in the 1950s they were releasing all of these classic movies that are classics now. And then in the 1980s, 70s and 80s, they were releasing all of these blockbusters, that were going on to change pop culture and revolutionize how movies were done. Star Wars. He talked about Star Wars a lot. And then in 2020, they're still releasing Star Wars. They're just remaking movies from the 1980s. Like, that's happened. They just did Nightmare on Elm Street again, like, 10 years ago. And it sucked. It was bad. Like, and this is true of all of these major movies. How many Marvel movies are there? Marvel movies, there's nothing new or original about them. That canon has been established for itself, like, 60, 70 years. If you start from, like, the golden age of comics, 50s. I think Marvel was a little later than that. I'm not a comics historian or a Back to the Future historian, and if you are, get off my page, nerd. But, like, first, correct whatever I'm saying. I'm trying to make the point that what we're doing is recycling, and we're recycling over and over again because nothing new or original is coming, and that's because we are, as a culture, not concerned with art. Art doesn't sell anymore. High culture doesn't sell anymore. Rome became this strong and incredible and beautiful city because that's what everyone set out to do, to make something great. And then they did, and it was great, and then it stopped. It leveled out. There was nowhere for it to go after that. And it is argued in the book that we're kind of doing the same thing, and that's what decadence means. It's this collapse into a sense of complete comfort and security that leads to self-destruction. It is a self-destructive comfort. It's like drug addiction, really. That's decadent. And we are all in the midst of it. These phones, and I mean the opioid epidemic itself, But even if you look at the quote-unquote food that we're eating, nothing is real. Much of what this current milieu is built on isn't real. So many of these things are just shadows on the wall, or cheap, paltry imitations. Like the majority of the food that we eat is just corn. It's just sugar pumped into cake form and then injected full of all these perfumes that touch the animal buttons in our brain for salt and fat and sweet. And so it feels like we're having this whole experience, but it's not an experience, it's a projection. There's no nutrition in that. In the same way that there's, if you look at the entertainment that we're currently consuming, who is entertained by this? We haven't made anything valuable, anything to really affect, like cinema. We talk about cinema, and like, I'm not trying to be like a fart sniffer, I'm not trying to unironically use the word kino or anything like that. But when was the last time you saw a good movie? Let alone a great movie, let alone a Citizen Kane. They don't make Citizen Kanes anymore. They don't even make Nightmare on Elm Streets anymore. They, like, that's a low bar, dude. Like, I like horror movies, but like, you get what I'm saying here. It doesn't take much to make an original slasher. And we don't have those anymore. We don't have originality like that anymore, because we do live in this decadent society. And our boy Ross isn't wrong about that. We are victims of our own success. And there are those of us who are existing in the substrate of the society and hoping for something better, like this nostalgia for a past that we never had. And there's this sort of countercultural movement happening, this returning to tradition, where these people want to embrace these high ideals and pursue real art and read ancient literature and philosophy and all this stuff. And I think it's very noble, it makes sense. But you have to keep in mind that you're swimming in the muck with the rest of us. Like, no matter what happens, we're still going to be stuck in this situation together. If everybody gets on board, maybe we can pull ourselves out of it. But that is a tall order, and it's going to be really hard to convince. Let's just talk about America. 336 million people, that being super comfortable and not having to try hard at anything is bad, and they should be less comfortable and try hard for no immediate personal gain, but because it would make the world better. Like, that's a hard sell. If somebody came like 20 years ago when I did nothing but like smoke weed and play video games, and somebody came to me and they said, hey, you need to stop doing all of that and become a celibate gravedigger for the betterment of society, I would hit them, because I did a lot of hitting back then too. Book was a little too politically loaded for me and kind of boring, honestly. Like, it dragged, so I gotta knock a couple of stars off for that. But conceptually it was interesting. What was the word he kept using? It wasn't stagnation, it was what happens to the heart when you have heart disease? It's like clogged artery medical name. Yep. Sclerosis. He kept calling us a sclerotic society. He kept implying like that was what the situation, not implying, he'd straight out say that this is like this pandemic sclerosis that is preventing anything from advancing, because we're in this constant state of stagnation and there's no, it's all good enough. We're in a place of good enough. There are no enormous medical advances. We don't have a new penicillin. We don't have a new polio vaccine. We don't need it. There hasn't been anything of substance to cure like that since the invention of these in the previous era when we did accomplish great things. Like, yeah, now we're fighting with cancer and heart disease, but these are diseases of diabetes. These are diseases of civilization. They're because all we do is eat zebra cakes and watch TV. You know, this is the decadence that's killing us. It's literally killing us. It is the biggest killer in America right now. And he says it's gross and we should stop, but he doesn't provide any like convincing arguments as to how stopping would be accomplished. Not that I would expect him to. He's a pundit. You know, pundits don't offer solutions, they just complain about problems. And for that reason, I'm gonna give it 2 stars out of 5, because if I wanted to hear somebody whine, I'd just go outside. People are whining all the time. You ever notice? It's because we live in a society. Alright, that's enough. Thanks for tuning in yet again. Like, follow, subscribe.